Hey guys, tonight we walk down into the oldest shadows we can find, into the dust of ancient Mesopotamia, where broken tablets, buried rooms and half-legible signs may hint at something unsettling and strangely fascinating, the possibility that even the gods, or at least the beings later called the Anunnaki, could be judged, confined and pushed beneath the earth. Some parts of tonight's journey rest on widely accepted history, on archaeology, on what survives in clay and ruin. Some parts are interpretation, because ancient words do not always sit politely still for modern readers. And some parts are calm, what-if imagination, because the old stories have a way of opening doors where the evidence only leaves a crack. Historians debate plenty here, and that is part of the charm. You probably will not survive this comfortably if you are expecting neat little answers gift-wrapped with a clay seal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, post your location and local time in the comments, so I can see where in the world you are drifting off tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in southern Iraq though. Of course the people you are visiting would not call it that. To them, this is a land of cities and canals, brick walls drying under a hard sun, temple platforms rising above flat ground, and scribes pressing wedge-shaped marks into damp clay, while the river mud clings to their sandals like it has strong opinions. Most historians agree that ancient Sumer flourishing in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE gave us some of the world's earliest cities and writing systems. What's broadly accepted is that these people recorded trade prayer law hymns and myths on tablets by the tens of thousands. The evidence we do have points to an astonishingly literate bureaucracy, though literate here means a small trained class doing the writing while everybody else is busy staying alive, which honestly feels familiar. And buried among those tablets are references to gods, divine assemblies, punishments, descents below the earth, and places that seem less welcoming than a modern airport security line. That is where the mood begins to shift. The Anunnaki in the broadest and safest sense are divine beings known from Mesopotamian tradition. They appear in Sumerian and later Akkadian texts, though their roles change across time, place and genre. Sometimes they look like high-ranking deities connected to cosmic order. Sometimes they seem like judges of the underworld. Sometimes they are simply part of a divine collective, important but not easy to pin down in one neat sentence. Let me rephrase that more carefully. If you are hoping the Anunnaki are one tidy cast of characters with matching outfits and name tags, the tablets are not that cooperative. They are more like a long-running family franchise with missing episodes, contradictory spin-offs, and at least one scribe who absolutely should have written more clearly. Still, one thing stands out almost immediately. Mesopotamian religion often imagines the universe in layers. You have heaven above earth in the middle and the underworld below. Temples serve as meeting points between human and divine space. Gates matter. Thresholds matter. Descent matters. Archaeology suggests that temples were not just symbolic structures, but real administrative centres packed with storage rooms, courtyards, workshops and restricted areas. Some had substructures or buried elements tied to ritual and foundation. What's broadly accepted is that ancient sacred architecture loved hierarchy. The closer you get to the centre, the fewer people are allowed in. The deeper you go, the stranger the silence becomes. One interpretation is that this architecture gave ancient people a physical language for thinking about confinement. Not prison in the modern sense, with bars and orange jumpsuits, and somebody sadly poking cafeteria peas, but controlled access sealed rooms, hidden chambers and being placed below. A careful reading might suggest that when myths speak of beings cast down enclosed or forced beneath the earth, They are drawing from the same mental world that built temples with hidden interiors and buried foundations. That does not mean, to be clear, that archaeologists have uncovered a sign reading divine detention block this way. That is a possibility, not a certainty. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is this: Mesopotamian people thought deeply about order. Their cities depended on it. Water had to be channeled. Fields had to be measured. Offerings had to be made correctly. Kings ruled priests, managed rituals. Scribes tracked goods, and everyone lived with the sense that chaos was always nearby, perhaps just one broken canal away. Most historians agree that their myths reflect this constant tension between order and disruption. So when divine beings are shown quarrelling, rebelling, judging, or being sent below, it is not random decoration. It mirrors the real anxieties of urban life. Historians still argue whether references to divine descent and confinement should be read mainly as underworld symbolism, political metaphor, or traces of something more specifically punitive. That debate matters, because if the stories are only about death, then the mood is one thing. If they also carry the logic of sentencing containment and enforced removal, then the mood changes. Suddenly you are not just in a religion, you are in a system. And systems, even sacred ones, tend to develop basements. Imagine walking at dusk beside a temple wall at or Uruk. The air still holds heat from the day. Reeds whisper somewhere by the canal. A servant passes carrying oil. A dog noses around a pile of broken pottery like a freelance archaeologist. Above you, the temple rises in mud brick stages, glowing dull gold in the last light. You know there are rooms inside you will never enter. You know some spaces are for offerings, some for records, some for the movement of priests, and some perhaps for objects or rites kept from common view. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if beneath the practical storage and ritual order there also lived a fear that certain powers had to be put somewhere sealed, somewhere named carefully and kept below? That is where the prison idea begins, not as a discovery, but as a puzzle. A fringe idea proposes that scattered Mesopotamian texts preserve memories of literal divine imprisonment of gods sentenced and buried alive beneath sacred places. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because ancient literature does contain striking images of beings thrown down, trapped in the netherworld, bound by decrees or cut off behind gates. A more cautious explanation could be that these are mythic ways of talking about death, defeat, cosmic hierarchy, or ritual separation. In other words, the old stories may be dramatic because old stories enjoy being dramatic. Subtlety was not always the brand. Even so, the language of below matters. Burial mattered. Foundation deposits mattered. Hidden chambers mattered. The underworld was not a vague cloudland, but a place with rulers, judges, gates, roads, and rules. Archaeology suggests that ancient Mesopotamians connected physical depth with sacred meaning. Things placed under floors, under walls, and under thresholds were not merely discarded. They were positioned, marked, sometimes protected, sometimes neutralized. And if something dangerous was neutralized, the imagination naturally asks the next question. What if it had once moved? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is city life, temple, life writing, divine names, and a worldview structured by layers and boundaries. The interpretation is that scattered clues about descent, sealing, and punishment might form a pattern. The imagination is the cool breath of an underground chamber where a story lingers longer than the torchlight. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So you keep walking deeper into the world of clay and shadow, listening for gates, for verdicts, for the quiet suggestion that under the oldest temples there may have been more than brick and dust. Maybe only stories. Maybe the memory of judgment. Maybe the first hint that even the gods could be sent below. Once that possibility settles in your mind, you start noticing how often the gods of Mesopotamia behave less like drifting abstractions and more like a royal household with divine lighting and worse emotional boundaries. Most historians agree that Sumerian religion reflects the structure of the world that produced it. Cities had kings, councils, storehouses, labour forces, and legal disputes. So heaven in the texts often looks suspiciously organised in the same way. Archaeology suggests that the people who built temple complexes and palace courts were not imagining order as some soft, glowing principle. They imagined it as something administered, managed, counted, sealed, probably complained about. That matters because if divine society mirrors human society, then divine punishment may also mirror human punishment. You can feel that logic beginning to form as you move through the literature. The gods gather in assemblies. They make decisions. They distribute rank. They control territory. They issue decrees. That is not fringe. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myth frequently presents the cosmos as a place governed by hierarchy. Some gods command, some serve, some judge, some plead, and some rather awkwardly rebel or fail. One interpretation is that these stories use divine characters to express the same anxieties people felt in city life: who obeys, who belongs, who gets cast out, and what happens when order breaks. If the universe is imagined as a kingdom, then punishment is never far behind. This is where the prison idea becomes a little less wild and a little more intelligible, even if it remains debated. A careful reading might suggest that when certain divine beings are pushed down restrained, blocked by gates, or shut away beneath the earth, the texts are using the same political imagination that shaped earthly rule. Not a modern prison with neat rows of cells, of course. Ancient Mesopotamia did not build incarceration systems the way modern states do. A more cautious explanation could be that the relevant language points instead to exile, confinement, ritual, isolation, forced descent, or status removal. But all of those live in the same neighbourhood. Spiritually speaking, it is still a very unpleasant housing arrangement. You start with kingship because kingship is everywhere. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian rulers were seen as chosen, favoured, or upheld by the gods. They were not themselves gods in the full Egyptian sense, at least not usually, but they stood close to divine authority. Royal inscriptions boast of building temples, restoring order, defeating enemies, and honouring the gods through proper administration. The evidence we do have points to a world where earthly order was inseparable from sacred approval. If the city ran well, the cosmos seemed aligned. If it failed, then somebody somewhere had displeased somebody very powerful. That style of thinking runs straight into myth. In the myths, divine authority often looks formal. Great gods sit in councils. Decisions are not always personal whims. They can sound legal, almost constitutional, if your constitution is written in poetry and occasionally involves monsters. Enlil commands, Enki advises, Inanna negotiates, pushes, and occasionally storms through boundaries like the one person in a meeting who definitely read the agenda and decided to fight it anyway. The Anunnaki, depending on the text, appear as high-ranking gods, assembly members, or judges, especially in underworld contexts. What's broadly accepted is that they are not random decorative names. They belong to a structured divine order. And structured orders have penalties. Historians still argue whether the divine assemblies in Sumerian literature should be read mainly as symbolic reflections of human courts or as religious concepts with their own independent logic. That debate is worth keeping close. It reminds you not to flatten everything into allegory. The gods are not merely humans in fancy hats, but the overlap is hard to miss. A society that lived by rulings, oaths, obligations, and boundary stones would naturally imagine cosmic life in similar terms. One interpretation is that punishment among the gods was thinkable because punishment governed everything below them too. You can even sense it in the language of rank. In Mesopotamian texts, status is precious. Names matter. Offices matter. Domains matter. To lose place is to lose identity. So when a divine being is pushed downward, deprived of movement, denied return, or made subject to the underworld, that reads not only as drama, but as a kind of sentence. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is a useful possibility. It helps explain why the imagery feels so legal, even when the scene is mythic. Think of a palace audience hall. A ruler sits elevated. Officials stand nearby. Petitioners wait. A verdict is spoken. Someone favoured walks out relieved. Someone else is escorted away, not necessarily in chains, but under authority, under decision, under the irreversible weight of a word. Now lift that whole scene upward into divine narrative. The architecture changes. The costumes get more expensive. The consequences become eternal. But the logic is not entirely different. A fringe idea proposes that some stories of divine descent preserve memories of actual sacred confinement, rituals perhaps tied to buried chambers or temple substructures where dangerous powers were symbolically contained. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because Mesopotamian sacred space already makes room for the hidden, the sealed, and the restricted. Archaeology suggests that temples included storerooms, platforms, courtyards, and inner areas with controlled access. The evidence we do have points to a culture comfortable with sacred separation. Not everything holy was meant to be seen. Not everything dangerous was meant to be loose. And if a god or divine being became dangerous, what then? That question hangs quietly behind more than one myth. Not because the texts line up into a single master theory, they do not. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The tablets are less like a clean documentary series and more like finding 15 episodes from 3 different centuries with the subtitles missing. Still across those fragments, you see a repeated concern with keeping order against disruption. The gods themselves must be ordered, ranked, persuaded, and occasionally opposed. If divine rebellion exists at all in the literature, then divine discipline must exist too. What if the stories are pointing at something else? What if being sent below in these texts is not only about death or cosmic geography, but about what every city fears the need to remove a threat without destroying the whole structure around it? In a world built of mud brick and hierarchy, you do not casually shatter the foundation. You bury what must be contained. You seal what must not rise. You put a door, then another door, then perhaps a hymn on top of it, just to be safe. Ancient project management, but with more incense. Scholars continue to debate how literally to take divine punishments in myth. There's no full consensus, and that is healthy. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion mirrors kingship law and administration in important ways. One interpretation is that stories of punished gods borrow the logic of earthly courts, and the calm what-if mood that slips in here is simple enough to feel at night. If heaven copied the palace, then perhaps its punishments copied the dungeon too. You keep moving through the old cities with that thought beside you. The same clay that records grain deliveries also records hymns. The same scribal hand that counts sheep may copy a story about divine judgment. The same culture that builds walls, thresholds, and restricted rooms also imagines a universe ordered by decree. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Some are solid, some are missed, and some only become visible when you stop asking the ancient world to behave like a modern filing cabinet. So the gods begin to look less distant now. They sit in councils, they rank one another, they hand down decisions, they guard access, and somewhere in that formal, stern, deeply human divine order, you begin to glimpse the unsettling possibility that when a god crossed the line, there may have been a place below for that too. By now you have the shape of the world in your mind, and it is not a soft one. It is a world of layers, verdicts, thresholds, and consequences where even divine power can be described in the language of dissent. That brings you to one of the most unsettling phrases in the whole idea we are following tonight, buried alive. Not because the tablets give you one neat line that says exactly that in modern English, tied up with a dramatic soundtrack and a helpful footnote, but because Mesopotamian literature so often places punishment ceiling and downward motion in the same symbolic space. Archaeology suggests that burial foundation rites and underworld imagery were central to how ancient Mesopotamians imagined danger protection and the boundary between the living and the hidden. One interpretation is that certain phrases about being sent below may carry not only mythic meaning, but the emotional force of sentencing. That is where the air gets cooler. Most historians agree that the ancient Mesopotamian underworld was not imagined as a vague cloud realm. It had structure, it had gates, it had rulers, it had roadways, judges' attendants, and the bitter finality of a place that was hard to leave. What's broadly accepted is that burial and descent mattered symbolically because the earth itself was a threshold. To go beneath it was not just to vanish, it was to enter a governed domain. The evidence we do have points to a culture that thought spatially about power. Above meant visibility, sky temple height, life and rule. Below meant depth darkness, storage foundation, tomb secrecy, and the underworld. You do not need a giant neon sign saying punishment zone to feel the emotional charge of being forced downward in that kind of world. And then there is the strange overlap between burial and containment. In Mesopotamian practice, things were placed under floors and within foundations for specific reasons. Archaeology suggests that foundation deposits could include inscribed objects, ritual items, and symbolic materials meant to protect or define a building. What's broadly accepted is that such deposits were not casual trash pits. They were deliberate acts. The lower spaces of sacred and royal buildings mattered because they were thought to stabilize what stood above. One interpretation is that this physical practice created a powerful metaphor in literature. To place something below was to fix it, neutralize it, bind it to a position. A careful reading might suggest that stories of divine beings forced downward draw emotional strength from this shared cultural logic. That does not mean a god in a myth is literally equivalent to a foundation peg in a temple wall. Let me rephrase that more carefully before the ancient scribes file a complaint. What it means is that the same culture can use the act of placing below as both ritual practice and poetic image. That overlap is exactly where mystery likes to move in and redecorate. Historians still argue whether language of descent, burial, or sealing in Mesopotamian texts should be understood primarily as afterlife, imagery, metaphorical humiliation, ritual, symbolism, or traces of more specific punishment traditions. There's no full consensus, and that is part of why the subject remains so fascinating. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that below mattered. The interpretation is that below could function as a sentence. The imagination is what happens when you picture a chamber under a temple floor and wonder whether ancient listeners heard more than one meaning in that image. You can feel that double meaning in the phrase itself. Buried alive in a modern ear sounds immediate and graphic, but in Mesopotamian symbolism, it may also evoke something wider being removed from the realm of movement, light and status while still remaining somehow present. Not gone, not annihilated, just fixed below. That is what makes it eerie. Death is one thing, confinement is another. A more cautious explanation could be that many of these ancient scenes are really about transition into the underworld, not imprisonment as such. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the emotional difference is hard to ignore. One goes below because all humans do. The other goes below because judgment sent them there. And judgment is everywhere in Mesopotamian sacred thought. The gods judge humans. Kings judge disputes. The dead are processed in realms beyond sight. Oaths bind. Curses fall. Doors close. Nothing about this literary universe feels casual about consequences. So when you encounter imagery of someone or something being put under the earth, sealed away, or denied return, it can read less like random scenery and more like a formal removal. A fringe idea proposes that some of these images preserve memories of condemned divine beings literally entombed beneath sacred sites. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it speaks to a real tension in the texts. The line between underworld residence and punitive confinement is not always as sharp as you might expect. Picture a temple at night. The upper rooms are dark now. The offerings are done. The scribes have set aside their tablets. Somewhere a lamp still burns low in an inner space, and the mud brick walls breathe out the day's stored warmth. Below the visible floor lie earlier floors' buried repairs, deposits, fragments of older shrines, maybe the remains of structures swallowed by rebuilding. Mesopotamian cities rose in layers, one age building over another, until the ground itself became history stacked like forgotten paperwork. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if ancient listeners, already used to cities built on buried cities, found it entirely natural to imagine punishment as being placed under the living world and held there? That would not just be burial. That would be social and cosmic silence. Most historians agree that these ancient cities were rebuilt again and again, creating artificial mounds over centuries. What's broadly accepted is that the earth beneath any temple or palace often held earlier foundations and forgotten spaces. One interpretation is that this physical layering shaped the imagination. The below was not empty. It was occupied by memory debris, old walls and symbolic depth. So when myths speak of sending beings under the earth, the image lands in a world where below is already full of the past. Ancient urbanism accidentally becomes excellent horror set design, though in a very polite, dust-covered way. A popular rumour claims that certain broken passages refer to rebellious gods sealed beneath temple foundations as a literal warning. That's a dramatic reading, and it is not broadly accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that the buried setting simply intensifies the emotional force of divine defeat. Even so, the rumour survives because buried things in Mesopotamia never feel entirely gone. They remain underfoot, under walls, under ritual. They remain part of the building's life. And that is exactly what makes the prison idea so sticky. A prison beneath the temple would not merely remove a threat. It would pin that threat into the very order it once threatened. You can see why storytellers love that. The evidence we do have points to a culture that linked depth with power, burial, with symbolism and confinement, with cosmic geography. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Some clues are sturdy as fired brick. Some are soft as dust. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Still, as you listen to the old phrases about descent and sealing it, it becomes possible to hear something more than ordinary death in them. Not always. Not conclusively, but enough to keep you leaning closer. Because maybe being sent below was not only an ending, maybe it was a sentence. Maybe the oldest prison in the story was not built of bars at all, but of earth threshold and sacred language spoken over a closed place no one was meant to open again. Once you begin hearing descent as more than scenery, the underworld itself starts to change shape. It is no longer just a gloomy backdrop for dramatic exits and mythic sighing. It begins to look organised, regulated and strangely procedural, which is exactly the kind of detail ancient Mesopotamia loves. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian people imagined the underworld as a real domain with rules, rulers and boundaries. What's broadly accepted is that this was not a place of fiery moral torture in the later medieval sense, but a shadowy land of dust, darkness, and limited return governed by powerful deities and entered through gates. Archaeology suggests that the same culture that built walls, doors, courtyards, and restricted sacred areas also imagined the unseen world in similarly structured terms. One interpretation is that the underworld can sometimes feel less like a grave and more like a lockup. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it is an interesting one. You already know some of the broad outline. The Mesopotamian underworld is often called the land of no return. It is associated with the dead, with dust, with silence, with the loss of ordinary status and movement. The rulers and officials of that realm vary somewhat across texts and periods because the ancient Near East absolutely refuses to keep one consistent franchise Bible, but Ereshkigal looms large, and so do underworld judges, gatekeepers, messengers and attendants. The Anunnaki in certain contexts are linked to judgment there. Most historians agree that underworld scenes in Mesopotamian literature are among the clearest examples of divine bureaucracy, which I have to admit is not the glamorous side of mythology people usually put on posters. Still, bureaucracy matters. A careful reading might suggest that the underworld structure is one reason prison-like interpretations keep surfacing. If a realm has gates, officials' verdicts, regulated access, and categories of beings who may enter but not easily leave, then the emotional overlap with confinement becomes hard to ignore. A more cautious explanation could be that all of this simply reflects ancient ideas about death as orderly passage. That may well be true much of the time. But the line between a realm of the dead and a realm of detention can become thin when the literature emphasises closure, separation and enforcement. Historians still argue whether the underworld in Mesopotamian myth should be understood mainly as an afterlife destination, or in some passages as a broader symbol of cosmic containment. That debate matters because the prison theory lives right there in the ambiguity. If the underworld is only where all the dead go, then its gates are funerary. If in some cases it also receives being sent down by decree, denied ordinary movement, or trapped behind divine authority, then it starts to resemble something sterner. You can hear that sternness in the famous descent traditions. In myths of descent, crossing into the underworld is never casual. There are stages, thresholds, stripped powers and formal exchanges. The traveller is diminished on the way down. Items are surrendered. Rank is reduced. Doors matter at every turn. What's broadly accepted is that this literary pattern reflects how serious the boundary was. One interpretation is that the repeated removal of status at each gate resembles not just death ritual, but controlled entry into a place of confinement. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the image becomes chilling in a very quiet way. The underworld does not need iron bars if every gate takes a piece of you. And there are many gates. 7 gates appear in later Mesopotamian underworld imagery, especially in the descent of Inanna or Ishtar traditions, though the exact form differs by text. Most historians agree that the number and sequence are symbolic, emphasizing inevitability and progressive loss. A fringe idea proposes that the gates preserve memory of initiation spaces or actual controlled chambers in temple complexes, later transformed into cosmic geography. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because ancient sacred architecture really did care about nested access. Outer court, inner court, holy room, hidden room. You can see how the mind could scale that pattern downward into myth. Above ground, temples train people to respect restricted movement. Below ground, stories turn restricted movement into destiny. Imagine standing before the first gate. The air is still. Dust lies in the seams of stone or packed earth. A gatekeeper waits with the patience of someone who has not been impressed in several thousand years. You are told to surrender something, then pass on to the next threshold, and the next, until all the little markers that once said who you are have been peeled away. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if this is not just how to describe death, but how to describe sentencing, reduction and control in the oldest possible language? The evidence we do have points to a larger Mesopotamian fascination with confinement by boundary. Nets can trap, curses can bind, oaths can hold, doors can exclude, names can authorize access or deny it. Archaeology suggests that sealed spaces mattered in ritual life, whether storehouses, archives, buried deposits, or inner chambers. What's broadly accepted is that sacred power was often managed through containment rather than openness. One interpretation is that the underworld becomes the ultimate contained zone, the final restricted area guarded and administered. That would fit a culture obsessed with order. It would also explain why later readers keep returning to the idea of divine imprisonment. A popular rumour claims that certain Anunnaki or rebellious divine figures were sentenced to the underworld the way criminals are sent to a dungeon. That is too tidy to treat as established fact. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do not hand you a neat prison roster and a divine warden with a clay clipboard, but they do give you enough imagery of judgment descent confinement and non-return that the rumour feels emotionally plausible, even if not textually settled. And emotional plausibility has a long shelf life. Scholars continue to debate the exact function of the Anunnaki in underworld settings. In some texts they appear as judges. In others their role is more diffuse. There's no full consensus, especially when later traditions blur older Sumerian patterns with Akkadian reinterpretations. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is an underworld of gates and governance. The interpretation is that such a realm may sometimes function as divine lockup. The imagination is the sound of a door below the world closing with ceremonial calm. And that sound lingers because ancient Mesopotamia does something especially unsettling here. It makes confinement feel normal, not melodramatic, not shouted, just official. A decree is made, a gate is opened, a being goes below. The order of the cosmos continues. No one writes a protest song. The scribes keep writing grain accounts. Somewhere above bread is baked reads are cut, and a temple servant complains that the oil jars are heavy. Below a sentence may last forever. That ordinary quality is what makes the underworld so easy to imagine as prison. Not because anyone needs to announce it outright, but because all the pieces are already there. Hierarchy, judgment, gates, loss of rank, no return, and officials doing their work with the soul-flattening efficiency of every institution that has ever loved a stamp and a seal. So as you move deeper into the old stories, the underworld stops looking like empty darkness. It becomes architecture, procedure, rule, and somewhere in that heavily administered gloom, you begin to understand why later minds would wonder whether certain gods were not merely dead or distant or hidden, but sentenced. Not destroyed, not forgotten, just kept below behind the gates. Once the underworld begins to feel architectural, you start noticing the hardware of the old stories. Not literal hardware in the shiny modern sense, of course. No polished steel, no keypad entry, no helpful little red light blinking to tell you the cell is secure. Mesopotamia does this in a more elegant and unnerving way. It gives you chains, gates, curses, decrees, oaths, and doors that feel heavier than the walls around them. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian literature repeatedly uses images of binding, shutting, barring, and sealing to express control. What's broadly accepted is that these are not random poetic flourishes. They belong to a larger mental world where order depends on limits, and where limits are enforced through both ritual and authority. One interpretation is that these images may preserve a theology of containment, the sense that dangerous forces, divine or otherwise, must be held in place. That idea settles over the text like dust over a closed threshold. The evidence we do have points to a civilization obsessed with boundaries. Field boundaries mattered, city walls mattered, temple thresholds mattered, legal boundaries mattered. Even language itself could function as a boundary, with an oath drawing a line you were not supposed to cross unless you wanted your life to become very educational. Archaeology suggests that doors, locks, seals and closures were practical realities in daily life, from storerooms to archives to sacred rooms. Most historians agree that a sealed object or sealed room in Mesopotamia was not only physically closed but socially defined. It was under control. It belonged somewhere. Someone had authority over it. That social force carries straight into myth. You hear it in curses first. Mesopotamian curses are not always loud and theatrical. Sometimes they are formal, almost administrative, which somehow makes them worse. A curse can bind a person to misfortune, call down divine oversight, or mark a violation as something now handed over to sacred enforcement. What's broadly accepted is that curses in inscriptions and legal formulas were part of a real belief system, not just decorative threats written for dramatic flair. One interpretation is that the same worldview that trusts a spoken curse to hold someone in place could also imagine cosmic beings restrained not only by chains or gates, but by decree itself. A careful reading might suggest that words in Mesopotamia often behave like walls. That may sound poetic, but it is also practical. Kings issue commands, priests recite rites, scribes record obligations, names identify power. To speak properly in the right setting is to change reality. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how sacred language works in many pre-modern cultures. True enough. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the prison theory becomes a little more subtle. Maybe a divine prison in Mesopotamian thought was not always a room first. Maybe it was a condition established by command, then symbolized by enclosure. First comes the sentence, then comes the gate. Historians still argue whether images of divine binding in Mesopotamian myth should be read literally, ritually, or symbolically. That debate matters because chains in ancient stories are rarely just chains. They can stand for defeat, fixed status, cosmic order, forced immobility or ritual exclusion. Yet the emotional effect remains the same. To be bound is to be acted upon. To be closed away is to have your movement defined by someone else. In a world where the gods themselves can bind demons, raise barriers, and close off realms, the idea of a sentenced divine being no longer sounds impossible within the literary logic. It sounds grimly consistent. And then there are the gates. You have already seen them in the underworld, but now they start to seem even more important. Mesopotamian literature loves gates because gates decide passage. They are not mere scenery, they are instruments of power. The gatekeeper matters because the gatekeeper controls transition, and transition is where authority reveals itself. Most historians agree that gate doors and thresholds held symbolic as well as practical value throughout the ancient Near East. Archaeology suggests that entrances were often ceremonially marked, protected, and invested with meaning. One interpretation is that mythic gates inherit that seriousness and make it cosmic. If a mortal door can guard grain records or sacred space, then an underworld gate can guard the condemned. A fringe idea proposes that some later readings of Anunnaki punishment are drawing on a real ancient fear of threshold entrapment. The idea that once a divine being passed a certain barrier return was no longer possible. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because so many myths make the crossing itself irreversible. Not always because of physical force alone, but because the gate represents jurisdiction. Once you are inside, another set of rules applies. Ancient bureaucracy again, now wearing a supernatural mask, and somehow still requiring paperwork in spirit. Picture a corridor beneath a temple, real or imagined, lined with cool brick and smelling faintly of damp earth and oil smoke. At the far end stands a sealed door, not dramatic, not glowing, just present. A mark impressed in clay shows that someone with authority closed it. Maybe the room behind it holds offerings, maybe records, maybe nothing at all, but the imagination does what imagination always does. It leans closer and wonders whether the ancient world, so comfortable with sacred restriction, ever let that sealed door logic spill into its stories of punished gods. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if gates and chains in the myths are not ornaments, but clues to a deeper grammar of containment? The Anunnaki fit into that grammar in uneasy ways. In some traditions they are judges. In others they are members of the divine order, subject to larger cosmic structures. Most historians agree that the exact identity and function of the Anunnaki shift across texts and centuries, which is another polite way of saying they refuse to sit still for your documentary outline. Still, what's broadly accepted is that they belong to a universe where rank and judgment matter deeply. One interpretation is that when stories later hint at gods sent below, locked away or forced into restricted realms, the same imagery of gates, oaths and bonds helps make that punishment believable to ancient listeners. And ancient listeners did not need modern prison imagery to understand the point. They knew what it meant to be shut out, to be put under oath, to be trapped by a decree, to stand on the wrong side of a threshold and discover that the door has legal opinions. A more cautious explanation could be that modern readers sometimes push prison language too hard onto ancient texts that are really about cosmology. That's fair. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not every gate is a jail door, not every binding is a handcuff, but enough of these images cluster around judgment and exclusion that the prison reading remains a meaningful possibility, even if it is suggestive, not conclusive. A popular rumour claims that condemned gods were literally chained in chambers below sacred sites. That is far more dramatic than the evidence can comfortably support. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is a world full of closures, seals, thresholds, and binding language. The interpretation is that these may form a theology of containment. The imagination is the soft scrape of a barred door below the floor, and the uneasy thought that something powerful once tested it. By now the pattern feels less accidental. Gates stop movement. Chains erase choice. Curses fix outcomes. Oaths hold the world together. And in the middle of all that old Mesopotamian seriousness, you begin to sense the possibility that if a divine being had to be neutralized, there were already plenty of ways to imagine it. Not always with violence, not always with spectacle, just with authority and closure and a sentence that settled like dust on a closed threshold. By now, you have walked through Gates' verdicts and the cold logic of being sent below. So the next question almost asks itself, what exactly would a god have to do to earn that kind of treatment? Ancient Mesopotamian myth, frustratingly and magnificently, does not hand you a clean case file. There is no preserved tablet titled Misconduct Review for Problematic Deities. That would be convenient, but the scribes apparently had other priorities like recording barley and surviving empire. Still, most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths do preserve conflict among divine beings. And what's broadly accepted is that these conflicts are not just decorative thunder. They often reflect deeper concerns about labour, rank, authority and rebellion. One interpretation is that later ideas of punished or buried gods grow naturally out of these divine conflicts, because once a cosmic hierarchy exists, someone will eventually challenge it. That is when prison starts to feel less like scenery and more like consequence. The oldest myths do not always present the gods as serene and perfectly cooperative. Quite the opposite. Divine life can be tense, competitive, and deeply political. Some gods command, others obey, others negotiate, and occasionally someone causes enough trouble that the whole universe needs a committee meeting. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion reflects the social realities of city-states and kingdoms, so it makes sense that its divine world includes rank disputes and strained loyalties. If heaven mirrors court life, then heavenly rebellion is not a bug. It is a feature, a very expensive, symbolically loaded feature, but still. The clearest mainstream safe anchor here is simple. In Mesopotamian literature, divine order matters because cosmic order matters. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where disruption among gods can ripple downward into creation, kingship, flood, famine, and fate. What's broadly accepted is that myths use divine conflict to explain why order must be restored again and again. One interpretation is that this restoration sometimes carries the flavour of sentencing. The rebel is not merely defeated, the rebel is reassigned, pushed away, or placed under control. And once again, the downward motion returns. A careful reading might suggest that stories of divine rebellion are often less interested in dramatic battle than in the question of what happens afterward. It is one thing to defeat a disruptive being, it is another to decide where to put them. In a mythic universe built on layers, the answer is often below. A more cautious explanation could be that descent simply marks defeat or cosmic relocation, not punishment in the prison sense. That is fair. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the logic still presses forward. If a god cannot be casually erased, then confinement becomes the sensible mythic solution. Eternal house arrest, only with more dust. Historians still argue whether the rebellious divine figures in Mesopotamian tradition should be understood as moral offenders, narrative devices, or symbols of forces that must be subordinated for civilization to exist. That debate is worth respecting, because the myths do not all speak in one voice. Some are about labour disputes, some are about rival powers, some are about cosmic succession, some are broken enough to make translators stare into the middle distance and reconsider their coffee. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but the common thread is hard to miss. Divine order is not automatic. It has to be enforced. That brings you toward one of the most important patterns in ancient myth more broadly, though Mesopotamia gives it a particularly stern flavour. The younger or subordinate powers rebel. The higher or organising powers respond. The threat is contained. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the old tales are not merely entertaining listeners with divine drama, but quietly teaching the same lesson every city must teach? Rebellion cannot simply be argued with forever. At some point, someone gets removed from circulation. And in these myths, removal often looks subterranean. A fringe idea proposes that later rumours of Anunnaki prisons preserve dim memories of specific rebellious gods, literally sealed beneath sacred ground. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is not hard to see why it caught on. The Mesopotamian imagination already links judgment, descent, and confinement. Add divine conflict to that mix, and suddenly the idea of a rebel god being buried below feels emotionally intuitive, not proven, not confirmed, just strangely fitting like an old key that may or may not open the door you found. You can almost feel the scene the storytellers might have wanted you to picture. A divine assembly gathers. The air is tense. Names are spoken with ceremonial care. A verdict is reached. The troublesome figure, whether god, lesser power, or cosmic disturber, is not publicly shredded in a blaze of final destruction. That would be too simple. Instead, the being is sentenced to a lower place, a restricted realm, a sealed condition. The cosmos does not forget them, it contains them. Ancient mythology has many ways of saying no, but this one has paperwork. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian divine society contains ranks and assemblies. Most historians agree that those assemblies matter because they formalise order. One interpretation is that a sentenced god is especially chilling because the sentence comes not from chaos, but from procedure. That is what gives these traditions their cold edge. The condemned power is not just overthrown, it is judged. And once judged, it goes below. There is also a human truth hiding inside that pattern. Ancient cities depend on cooperation, labour, irrigation, tribute and law. Anyone who threatens the system endangers everyone. So myths about rebellious divine beings may reflect a very practical fear. A rebellious god is not only a colourful character, it is a symbolic version of broken order itself. A more cautious explanation could be that the myths are simply explaining how present authority came to dominate earlier forces. But that too points in the same direction. Dominance is not enough. Stability requires containment. Scholars continue to debate how much later interpreters have exaggerated the rebel god imprisoned motif. There's no full consensus, and that should make you more interested, not less. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is divine conflict and hierarchy. The interpretation is that punishment may include controlled dissent. The imagination is the sound of a divine name being spoken one last time above ground before it disappears under the architecture of order. And if that sounds grim, well, ancient religion often is. It is not gloomy for the sake of being edgy. It is sober because survival is sober. Canals fail, harvests fail, kings fail. Why would the gods be the only ones allowed endless second chances? Mesopotamian myth is too realistic for that. It understands something uncomfortably modern institutions do not like: embarrassment, and cosmic institutions may dislike it even more. So the rebel god's tradition, such as it is, does not need a perfect surviving script to leave its mark. You already know enough. There are divine assemblies. There are tensions in rank. There are beings who resist or disrupt. There are underworld structures ready to receive the condemned. And there is a culture so comfortable imagining order through gates, layers and sealed depth that the idea of a prison for gods begins to feel less like a sensational headline and more like a logical extension of the world itself. Not certain, not settled, but very much possible in the old language of judgment, where the worst punishment may not be destruction at all, but being remembered only as a power once dangerous enough to bury alive in myth. That possibility lingers as you move into one of the most revealing old Mesopotamian stories of all, because if you want to understand how rebellion and punishment might echo through later ideas of divine imprisonment, you eventually find yourself standing in the world of Atrahasis. Most historians agree that the Atrahasis tradition, preserved in Akkadian versions and tied to older Mesopotamian themes, is one of the key texts for understanding how ancient people imagined the creation of humanity, divine labour and cosmic unrest. What's broadly accepted is that before humans are made lesser, gods are said to bear exhausting work on behalf of higher powers. One interpretation is that this labour conflict may preserve a mythic memory of divine discontent, serious enough to demand control. And what if the first great celestial labour dispute ends not only with the making of humanity, but with a rumour that somebody somewhere had to be put away afterward? That sounds dramatic, but the story itself is already dramatic. You begin with work, endless, repetitive, back-breaking work, digging canals, maintaining the earth, doing the sort of labour that makes your shoulders ache just hearing about it. In the myth, the lower-ranking gods, often associated with the Igigi, in later readings grow tired of serving the higher-ranking divine order. They complain, they rebel, they surround the dwelling of a major god. Most historians agree that this part of the story is not a side detail. It is the engine of the whole myth. Humanity is created in response to divine labour unrest. That is one of the oldest and driest workplace management solutions in literary history. If the staff revolts, invent a whole new species. Very efficient on paper, slightly concerning in practice. What's broadly accepted is that Atrahasis reflects the concerns of a highly organised agricultural civilization. Labour must happen. Irrigation must function. Order must be maintained. The evidence we do have points to a society where work was not an abstract virtue, but the difference between stability and disaster. One interpretation is that the divine labour revolt in Atrahasis mirrors human anxieties about collective unrest, obligation, and the danger of refusing one's place in the system. If heaven itself can suffer a labour strike, then the cosmos feels a lot less serene and a lot more like a kingdom one missed payroll cycle away from chaos. And that is where the prison idea begins to echo again. A careful reading might suggest that the Atrahasis revolt is important not only because it leads to human creation, but because it establishes a clear mythic principle. Even divine beings can resist assigned roles, and when they do, the system must respond. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth is simply using rebellion as a narrative trigger, not hinting at later punishment traditions. That may be true, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the aftermath matters just as much as the uprising. Once the divine hierarchy survives a revolt, it must make sure the same problem does not happen again. Ancient institutions are many things, but they are rarely casual about repeat incidents. Historians still argue whether Atrahasis should be read mainly as a myth of creation, a meditation on labour, a commentary on kingship, or a deeper reflection on cosmic order. The answer may be all of the above, because Mesopotamian literature is generous that way, and also mildly infuriating. Still, one thing stands out. Rebellion in this story is not meaningless. It forces restructuring. It changes the relationship between gods and the world. The lower divine ranks are no longer left to carry the same burden. Humans enter the picture to absorb labour. A system under stress responds by redistributing effort downward. That downward shift matters more than it first appears. The gods complain from below their burden. Humans are created below the gods, and the whole story becomes obsessed with pressure, moving downward until someone else carries it. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if later traditions of punished or confined divine beings are not random inventions, but echoes from a mythic memory in which divine unrest had to be managed, diverted, and possibly contained? Not necessarily with literal cells, not necessarily with buried chambers, but with removal reassignment and the hard closing of options. A fringe idea proposes that behind the labour revolt there once stood fuller stories of divine punishment that are now lost or only dimly preserved, perhaps including rebellious beings sent beneath the earth or shut away from ordinary cosmic function. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists for a reason. Mesopotamian myth does not like unresolved disorder. When something threatens the structure responds. Sometimes with negotiation, sometimes with creation, sometimes perhaps with exclusion. An exclusion in Mesopotamian storytelling often looks spatial. The evidence we do have points to a literary world where being lowered, sent away, or assigned beneath something carries enormous symbolic weight. Archaeology suggests that ancient Mesopotamian people lived among layered cities, buried foundations, and sacred buildings, whose lower levels mattered ritually as well as physically. One interpretation is that the imagination of below as a place of burden and containment was already deeply rooted. In Atrahasis, the lower gods are trapped in toil before humans take over. That is not prison in a modern sense, but it is already a form of cosmic confinement. Your role defines your movement. Your labour defines your status. Your burden keeps you in place. That may be why the myth feels so close to the prison theme, even when no tablet flatly announces it. Most historians agree that myths like Atrahasis are trying to explain why the world works the way it does, why humans labour, why the gods are above, why noise angers heaven, why order must be maintained despite recurring strain. What's broadly accepted is that the myth later moves toward overpopulation, divine irritation, plague, famine and flood, all of which deepen the sense that the relationship between gods and humanity is structured tense and never entirely comfortable. One interpretation is that divine punishment in Mesopotamian thought is not always explosive. Sometimes it is administrative. Sometimes it is a reallocation of burden. Sometimes it is a sentence built into the architecture of the world. That phrase matters here, built into the architecture of the world. Because if rebellion in Atrahasis leads to a new cosmic arrangement, then the myth already teaches a prison-adjacent lesson. The answer to unrest is not simply anger, it is system design. The loudest workers are replaced. The burden is transferred. The hierarchy survives. A more cautious explanation could be that this is just ancient theology rationalizing human toil. True enough, and rather bluntly too. But the emotional residue remains. Once you have a story where even divine beings can revolt against imposed labour, you also have a world where divine discipline is imaginable. Scholars continue to debate whether the rebellious lower gods in Atrahasis should be linked directly to later prison-like interpretations of the Anunnaki or treated as a separate motif altogether. There's no full consensus, and that is exactly where the interesting silence lives. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is a divine labour revolt and the creation of humanity. The interpretation is that rebellion and punishment may echo into later stories of confinement. The imagination is the vision of a cosmic work gang finally laying down their tools, while somewhere out of sight an older and harsher solution waits below. You can almost hear the scrape of those tools in the dust, the murmur of discontent rising in the dark, the tension in a divine residence, suddenly surrounded by exhausted beings who have had enough. That scene is not a prison yet, but it already contains the logic of one. There is labour, there is unrest, there is hierarchy. There is a need to preserve order without collapsing the whole system. Ancient Mesopotamia, with its canals and quotas and sacred bureaucracy, understands that kind of problem all too well. So Atrahasis leaves you with a curious feeling. Humanity may be created as relief for rebellious gods, yes. But beneath that official solution there lingers a quieter suspicion. If divine rebellion happened once, could it happen again? And if it did, would the answer always be negotiation, or would some beings eventually be sent somewhere deeper, sealed more thoroughly, and remembered only in broken hints about judgment below the earth? That suspicion follows you naturally into the physical world of temples, because once myth teaches you to think in layers, you cannot help noticing how layered Mesopotamian sacred buildings really are. Most historians agree that temples in ancient Mesopotamia were not simply places for private devotion. They were economic centres, ritual centres, political statements, and carefully managed sacred environments. Archaeology suggests that temple complexes often included courtyards, storerooms, work areas, platforms, inner rooms, and structural phases built one atop another over centuries. One interpretation is that these hidden and restricted spaces may have fed later imaginations about divine detention, and what if, beneath the incense and offerings, there lingered the idea that something important, dangerous, or ritually sensitive was being kept where ordinary feet did not belong. That thought begins above ground in daylight with brick. You walk toward a temple precinct, and the first thing you notice is not mystery, but management. Mesopotamian temples are busy places. Goods move in and out. Priests and workers perform their duties. Offerings are prepared. Records are stored. Labour is organised. Most historians agree that these sacred complexes were embedded in everyday urban life. What's broadly accepted is that the temple was both holy and practical, a meeting point between worship, administration and economy. The evidence we do have points to buildings full of controlled access, where different people were allowed into different zones depending on rank, duty and ritual status. One interpretation is that this culture of sacred restriction made hidden rooms feel especially meaningful, because what was kept out of sight was rarely unimportant. And temples had plenty of things out of sight. Archaeology suggests that many temple sites went through repeated rebuilding. Floors were raised, walls were repaired, old foundations were buried under new construction. Entire structural phases disappeared beneath later versions of the same sacred space. Over time, what had once been visible became entombed within the mound of the city itself. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian urbanism was vertical in a quiet way. Cities rose by accumulating their own past. That means temple basements, in the strict modern sense, are not always what you are dealing with. A more cautious explanation could be that many so-called hidden rooms are really substructures, buried earlier levels, storage spaces, or foundation zones, rather than neatly planned underground chambers. That matters. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Ancient Mesopotamia is not hiding a modern dungeon blueprint under every shrine, but it is full of spaces below sight, below floor level, and below ordinary access, and that is enough to stir the imagination. Historians still argue whether later claims about secret temple chambers preserving memories of divine prisons are based on meaningful ancient patterns or on modern fascination with underground spaces. That debate is healthy. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that temples had hidden, restricted and layered spaces. The interpretation is that such spaces could inspire stories of confinement. The imagination is the moment when a priest disappears through a doorway you are not allowed to use, and you realise the building knows more than you do. That feeling is important. Sacred architecture works partly by creating unequal knowledge. Most people in a Mesopotamian city would never see every room of a great temple. They would know the outer spaces, the processions, the public face, the smell of oil and baked bread, and animal offerings, the sound of sandals on packed earth. But the inner organisation, the deeper rooms, the places where offerings were stored or rites were conducted, would belong to specialists. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if a culture already accustomed to restricted sacred interiors found it perfectly natural to imagine that powerful beings, holy objects, curses, or even condemned entities could be kept below in spaces set apart from ordinary life? The idea does not need to be literally true to be culturally powerful. A fringe idea proposes that some temple substructures once served as symbolic holding places for dangerous divine forces, perhaps in ritual reenactments or stories now mostly lost. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because Mesopotamian religion consistently treats sacred space as active, not passive. A temple is not merely where you go to feel reverent for 10 minutes and then check your messages. It is where divine presence is managed. Presence can be invited, housed, appeased, restricted and redirected. One interpretation is that the same logic could extend to dangerous presence. If a force cannot be destroyed, perhaps it can be fixed in place. That would fit with foundation ritual too. Archaeology suggests that foundation deposits were often placed deliberately beneath important structures. These could include inscribed cones, figurines, symbolic objects, and materials intended to protect the building or mark its sacred legitimacy. Most historians agree that what goes under a temple matters because the below is not empty. It supports, defines, and stabilizes the visible structure. One interpretation is that later readers, seeing this repeated pattern of meaningful burial beneath sacred architecture, may have connected it to stories of beings forced below. A more cautious explanation could be that protective deposits and mythic punishments are separate symbolic traditions that only happen to overlap in modern retellings. That is possible, but even separate traditions can create the same emotional atmosphere. You still end up with temples standing over buried significance. And buried significance is almost impossible for the human mind to leave alone. Imagine the lower spaces of a temple at dusk. The upper courtyard is quieting. Lamps flicker in doorways. Somewhere a store jar scrapes against brick as it is moved into place. The smell is dust oil, old reeds, and the sweet sour trace of centuries. Beneath the floor lie earlier floors, older offerings, construction fills, foundation objects, forgotten repairs, maybe sealed niches, maybe simply the compressed memory of long use. Yet standing there you can feel how easily practical substructure becomes mythic understructure. What if in whispered stories what is below the temple is not only support but containment? Not merely old brick, but old judgment. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian sacred spaces often created emotional distance as well as physical restriction. The divine was near, but not casually accessible. That tension may be one reason rumours of hidden chambers attached themselves so easily to temples in later imagination. A popular rumour claims that ancient priests guarded literal prison rooms for rebellious Anunnaki beneath their sanctuaries. That is much too specific to treat as established history. The evidence we do have does not take you that far. But what's broadly accepted is that temples organised access concealed inner processes and stood atop meaningful buried layers. One interpretation is that such buildings offered the perfect setting for stories about powers kept under control. Scholars continue to debate whether sacred substructures in Mesopotamia should be read only in architectural and ritual terms, or also as part of a broader imagination of containment. There's no full consensus, and that should keep your feet on the ground even while your mind wanders below it. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Still, the clues are enough to change how you see the temple. No longer just a place of worship. Not merely a civic institution in mud brick form, but a building with above and below public and hidden offering and storage, prayer and restriction. A building whose very structure teaches the language of secrecy, a building that tells you wordlessly that not everything sacred belongs in the light. And once you learn that lesson from Mesopotamian architecture, the prison idea no longer sounds like a wild interruption from nowhere. It sounds like the sort of thought that might grow naturally in the mind of someone staring at an ancient temple and wondering what exactly had to be kept beneath all that order. And once you have stood long enough beside those temples with their hidden rooms and buried layers and practical sacred secrecy, you start to notice a useful correction. Ancient Mesopotamia, for all its gates and judgments and cosmic severity, does not really give you prisons in the modern sense. There is no neat penal code built around long-term incarceration, no standard cell block, no little divine mugshot archive waiting in a dusty drawer. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian justice worked very differently from the prison-centred systems many modern states rely on. What's broadly accepted is that punishment more often took the form of fines, restitution, corporal penalties, enslavement, exile, forced labour, or death, rather than years spent sitting in a designated jail, regretting your choices. One interpretation is that when myths seem to describe divine imprisonment, they may be using a different logic altogether. one rooted in exclusion, confinement, an irreversible status loss rather than prison as we know it. That distinction matters more than it first appears, because once you stop expecting a modern jail, the old stories begin making more sense. A more cautious explanation could be that many readers force the prison label too quickly onto texts that are really describing banishment, sealing, ritual, isolation or descent to the underworld. And honestly, that caution is fair. Let me rephrase that more carefully. If you picture a Mesopotamian correctional facility with scheduled meals and a complaints department, you are going to miss the point by several thousand years. But if you think in terms of controlled removal from ordinary life, forced placement under authority, and being put somewhere from which return is difficult or impossible, then suddenly the idea grows much clearer. Mesopotamian punishment is about position. Most historians agree that ancient law in Mesopotamia focused heavily on restoring order, compensating damage, and preserving hierarchy. The evidence we do have points to a legal culture concerned with consequences, yes, but also with social placement. If someone violates an obligation, the response is designed to settle the imbalance in a way everyone can recognise. What's broadly accepted is that punishment is not only pain, it is reassignment. It is public status made visible. One interpretation is that divine punishments in myth follow the same pattern. A god or powerful being who threatens order is not necessarily imprisoned in the modern sense. Instead, the being may be cast down, sealed away, fixed beneath, or denied movement. Different mechanisms, similar result. Cosmic grounded forever. That is why exile matters here too. Exile in the ancient world is one of the most devastating punishments imaginable because identity is tied to land, kin, cult, and city. To be cut off is to lose more than location. You lose belonging. A careful reading might suggest that divine descent in Mesopotamian myth often carries that same emotional weight. The punished being is not merely relocated. The being is placed outside proper participation in the ordered world above. A more cautious explanation could be that this is just afterlife geography and not punishment at all. Sometimes that is probably true, but historians still argue whether certain episodes of descent and confinement should be read as ordinary cosmology or as punishment narratives dressed in sacred language. And that is exactly where tonight's puzzle keeps breathing. You can also think in terms of captivity without prison. Ancient societies often held captives, restrained enemies, confined dangerous persons temporarily, or subjected them to controlled labour without creating a prison system like ours. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian states certainly understood detention and restraint, even if incarceration was not their main penal philosophy. Archaeology suggests that palaces' gates, guard rooms, and administrative complexes were equipped to control bodies when needed. One interpretation is that mythic language about bound beings, shut gates, and lower realms may draw from this broader culture of control rather than from a distinct prison institution. That may sound like a technical difference, but it changes everything, because once you let go of the word prison in its modern shape, the older evidence looks stronger, not weaker. A divine being cast beneath the earth, guarded by gates fixed under decree, stripped of ordinary rank, and denied return, is not imprisoned the way a modern judge might imprison someone. But the underlying social logic is still there. The being is contained, neutralized, removed from circulation. In other words, the old stories might not be describing a prison building. They may be describing imprisonment as a condition. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the most ancient version of prison is not a room at all, but a place in the cosmic map where movement ends and authority becomes total? That would fit Mesopotamia very well. This civilization loves territory boundaries, access hierarchy, and official decisions. It knows that control is often spatial. A field belongs here, a canal runs there. A priest may enter this room, a labourer may not. A dead king lies below. A dangerous being goes down and stays there. A fringe idea proposes that all later talk of Anunnaki prisons is really a modern mistranslation of older concepts like underworld exile or ritual immobilization. This theory isn't widely accepted in such an absolute form, but it carries an important warning. Words like prison can mislead if they flatten ancient thought into modern categories. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian punishment was rarely prison-centred in the modern sense. The interpretation is that divine prisons may actually be forms of exile, sealing, or cosmic confinement. The imagination is the vision of a condemned power learning that below the earth is not a dungeon exactly, just a place where every road goes one way. And that image has an odd kind of elegance to it. It also explains why the underworld feels so administrative rather than theatrical. Mesopotamian myth is not obsessed with torment for torment's sake. It is obsessed with order. If a being must be dealt with, the question is not how to make the scene exciting. The question is where to put that being so the structure holds. Most historians agree that this practical mindset runs through Mesopotamian law, kingship, and religion alike. What's broadly accepted is that disorder is dangerous because it threatens survival. One interpretation is that a sentenced god is therefore treated not as a melodramatic villain, but as a logistical problem. And ancient logistics are ruthless in their own sleepy way. Scholars continue to debate how much of this language is metaphorical, and how much reflects deeper cultural assumptions about spatial punishment. There's no full consensus, but the pattern itself is persuasive. Binding, casting down, closing off, assigning, below fixing, under authority. These are not random verbs. They all belong to a world that solves problems by placing things where they can no longer disrupt the centre. Picture again the temple city at evening. Smoke from cooking fires lifts into the dim sky. Somewhere a scribe smooths wet clay and presses signs that will harden by morning. A guard stands by a gate because gates are where control becomes visible. And under all of it lies the older truth. The city is built upon order, survives by deciding what stays inside, what stays outside, and what must remain below. So when later readers say the Anunnaki had prisons, the safest answer is not simply yes or no. The safer answer is more interesting. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian justice did not operate through prisons like ours. But one interpretation is that the myths preserve something prison-like, all the same divine punishment as confinement, exile, sealing, and irreversible removal, not a jail block, not a modern dungeon. Something older, something quieter. A sentence written into the map of the cosmos itself. Once you start thinking of punishment as placement rather than prison. In the modern sense, another part of Mesopotamian culture comes into focus almost immediately: foundations. Not just the practical ones holding up walls, though those matter plenty when your civilization builds in mud brick and lives one heavy rainstorm away from a very expensive problem. I mean the symbolic foundations, the ritual ones, the lower layers where protection, memory and hidden intention gather beneath what everyone else sees. Most historians agree that foundation rituals were deeply important in ancient Mesopotamia. Archaeology suggests that builders sometimes placed inscribed objects, figurines, cones, pegs or other meaningful items beneath structures to mark, protect or legitimize them. One interpretation is that stories of condemned gods being placed below may have blended in later imagination with these practices. And what if every threshold carried a rumour that something powerful had been fixed beneath it, not only to support the building but to stay there? That is where the ground becomes crowded. You are no longer standing only in a temple or only in a myth. You are standing at the point where architecture and imagination touch. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian buildings Especially important temples and palaces were often associated with formal dedication rites. The evidence we do have points to deliberate concern with what lies under the walls and beneath the floor. A foundation was not treated as dead material, it was activated space. It held texts, symbols, and gestures meant to establish order from below upward. One interpretation is that this made the beneath especially powerful in the Mesopotamian mind. To place something under a structure was to define its relationship to the whole building forever. That is already very close to punishment language. A careful reading might suggest that the symbolic logic of foundations and the symbolic logic of confinement are cousins. In both cases, something is fixed in position for the sake of stability. A more cautious explanation could be that foundation deposits are purely protective or commemorative and should not be casually mixed with myths of judged divine beings. That caution is fair. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A ritual object under a wall is not a prisoner, and scholars would be correct to glare at anyone who pretends otherwise. But the same culture can still use the act of putting something beneath a structure as a meaningful sign of control, support limitation, or sacred purpose. That shared emotional grammar is what matters tonight. You can feel it especially strongly with thresholds. Thresholds in the ancient world are never just where you wipe your sandals and hope for the best. They are symbolic edges. They separate one kind of space from another. Archaeology suggests that doors, gates, sockets, entryways, and boundary points received unusual care in both practical and ritual terms. Most historians agree that the line between inside and outside, pure and impure, permitted and forbidden, was treated seriously in Mesopotamian thought. One interpretation is that anything buried beneath thresholds or within foundations would inherit some of that seriousness. It becomes part of the building's authority, part of what makes the place hold. And if something dangerous needed to be held, where better than there? Historians still argue whether later stories about beings buried under buildings preserve any memory at all of actual ritual concepts from temple foundations, or whether this is mostly a modern habit of connecting two things that feel spooky together. That debate matters. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that foundation deposits were real and meaningful. The interpretation is that myths of divine punishment may have absorbed some of the same symbolic logic. The imagination is the quiet sense that when you step across a sacred threshold, you are walking over more than brick and packed earth. The old cities make that feeling easy to understand. They are layered places, built and rebuilt, one generation, sealing the remains of the last, under a fresh surface and a cleaner wall line. Most historians agree that over centuries, Mesopotamian settlements rose into tells because new construction constantly covered old ruins. What's broadly accepted is that the living city always stood over hidden remains. One interpretation is that this physical reality shapes stories about what lies below. If old walls and forgotten rooms are already under your feet, then it does not take much imagination to suppose that old judgments might be there too. Ancient urban planning accidentally becomes a partner in myth-making, which feels unfair but also very on brand. A fringe idea proposes that some traditions of gods buried alive began as ritual explanations for buried figurines or sealed foundation chambers discovered long after their original purpose was forgotten. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is not entirely absurd as a cultural mechanism. People in antiquity also encountered older remains they did not fully understand. A later generation finding strange objects beneath a sacred building might tell stories about why they were there. A more cautious explanation could be that such finds reinforced sacred awe rather than creating prison myths specifically. Still, awe and confinement can live side by side very comfortably, especially when the buried object looks deliberate, important, and decidedly not meant for ordinary handling. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if every foundation ritual is in symbolic terms a lesson in how Mesopotamia thinks about control? Things are placed, fixed, sealed, given a function beneath what stands above. That does not prove that condemned gods were literally buried under temples. It does, however, raise the possibility that such an image would feel deeply natural to Mesopotamian audiences. If a building's stability depends on what is set below, then perhaps the world's stability could be imagined the same way. Cosmic danger is handled not by endless combat, but by being placed under the order it once threatened. That is a very Mesopotamian solution. It is formal, spatial, quietly severe, and it avoids the messiness of total destruction. Most historians agree that ancient myth often preserves order by subordinating disruptive beings rather than erasing them outright. What's broadly accepted is that defeated powers in myth frequently remain present in altered form. One interpretation is that being buried below a threshold temple or cosmic layer would be an especially elegant version of that logic. The condemned is not gone. The condemned now supports the order it opposed. That is either profound theology or the oldest recorded case of being forced to help with the project after losing the argument. Either way, it leaves a mark. Scholars continue to debate whether foundation myths and prison-like interpretations of divine punishment should be kept strictly separate. There's no full consensus, and that should make you careful rather than dismissive. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Yet the clues are starting to form a pattern. Depth matters. Placement matters. Beneath is not empty. Beneath is where meanings become fixed. So you begin to imagine the city differently now. Not as a flat collection of buildings, but as a stack of decisions. Public decisions above ground. Hidden decisions below. Offerings, objects, inscriptions, older walls, forgotten rooms, foundation pegs, symbolic deposits, maybe just silence. And once in a while, in the soft blur between documented practice and mythic imagination, a more unsettling possibility flickers. Maybe some stories about sentenced gods survive because the very act of burying something meaningful beneath a sacred structure already felt like judgment made permanent. Not loud judgment, not theatrical judgment, just the patient dust-covered kind where the sentence does not hang on a wall for everyone to read, but rests below the threshold forever, doing its work in silence while the city carries on above. By the time you reach the realm of Ereshkigal, the whole subject stops feeling abstract. Up to now, you have walked through labour revolts, temple substructures, gates, foundation deposits, and the stern old logic of being sent below. But Ereshkigal's domain gathers all of those threads into one place and holds them there like dust in still air. Most historians agree that Ereshkigal is one of the central figures of the Mesopotamian underworld, a ruler associated with the land of the dead and the irreversible gravity of descent. What's broadly accepted is that the underworld was imagined as a place governed by strict order, not chaotic emptiness. One interpretation is that stories set in her realm can sound remarkably like imprisonment narratives. And what if a prison is simply what eternity looks like when the paperwork is written by gods and the gatekeeper never takes a lunch break? That is not a cheerful thought, which is probably why it works so well at bedtime. You enter her world through story rather than map, because Mesopotamian myth is generous with atmosphere and much less generous with tidy floor plans. Still, the atmosphere is consistent. The underworld is below. It is difficult to leave. It is ruled. It has gates. It has officials. It has rules no one is excited to test. Most historians agree that this structure matters. The evidence we do have points to an afterlife realm imagined not as free-floating sadness, but as jurisdiction. That single word changes everything. Jurisdiction means authority. Authority means boundaries. Boundaries mean enforcement. And suddenly the line between underworld and lockup becomes less dramatic than you might think. Ereshkigal herself is part of that stern beauty. She is not a reckless monster leaping out of the dark just to keep the plot moving. What's broadly accepted is that she is a ruler, and rulers in Mesopotamian literature are often defined as much by management as by power. One interpretation is that her realm feels prison-like because it operates on the same principles as every other properly administered domain in Mesopotamia. There are rules, ranks, entrances, and consequences. A more cautious explanation could be that modern readers hear prison tones because they are used to institutional language, while ancient listeners may simply have heard a solemn image of the afterlife. That is possible, but historians still argue whether the land of no return in some stories functions only as a destination for the dead, or also as a model of cosmic confinement. That debate grows sharper when you think about return, or rather the lack of it. The land of no return is one of the most memorable labels in ancient literature for a reason. It is final, directional, and deeply administrative. It tells you at once what kind of realm this is. Not endless torment, not adventurous exploration, not a pleasant countryside where you bump into old friends and discuss grain yields. It is the place you go and do not casually leave. What's broadly accepted is that this non-return motif reflects Mesopotamian seriousness about death and cosmic boundaries. One interpretation is that the same motif also gives the underworld its prison quality. A prison is not always defined by bars. Sometimes it is defined by the absence of exit. The famous descent narratives sharpen that impression beautifully. In the story of Inanna's descent, or in later Akkadian traditions involving Ishtar, the movement downward is formal and costly. Items of power are removed at each gate. Status is stripped. Dignity is peeled away in stages. Most historians agree that the details vary by version, but the overall pattern is stable enough to matter. Descent is regulated, it is supervised. It is not a tumble into chaos. One interpretation is that this structure resembles not only death ritual, but controlled entry into a realm where the traveller no longer sets the terms. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the prison idea becomes very hard to ignore. You do not need iron bars when the universe itself keeps taking your credentials. And ancient Mesopotamia absolutely loves credentials. Seals, names, garments, insignia, offices, privileges, access. Remove those and you do more than inconvenience a person. You alter their place in the system. A careful reading might suggest that the stripping process in descent myths is a way of expressing total subordination. The one who enters below must give up markers of freedom and rank. A more cautious explanation could be that these are ritual dramatizations of death's humbling power, rather than imprisonment. Fair enough. But the emotional overlap remains. Loss of rank, enforced passage, no easy return judgment by those already inside. If that is not prison-like, it is at least prison-adjacent in an extremely ancient accent. A fringe idea proposes that Ereshkigal's realm preserves a dim memory of older myths in which condemned divine beings were sent below not as dead souls, but as sentenced powers. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the underworld in Mesopotamian literature often holds more than ordinary dead humans. It can be a place of judges, divine beings, monsters, and authorities. That makes it flexible. It can absorb multiple meanings, a realm of death, yes, but perhaps also a realm of custody, not proven, not confirmed, just possible enough to keep the door slightly open. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the underworld becomes prison-like? Not because the Mesopotamians were confused about death, but because they understood that the best way to describe irreversible control is through a place ruled from below. You can fight an army, you can challenge a king, you can even bargain with a god if you have enough nerve or poetry. But once you are in a governed realm whose whole identity is no return, the terms have changed. You are not negotiating from strength anymore. You are inside someone else's order. That is why Ereshkigal matters so much to this whole question. She gives the below a face. Not a comforting one, but not a cartoonish one either. Most historians agree that the underworld in Mesopotamian thought is not random darkness. It is rule without softness. What's broadly accepted is that this rule mirrors the larger Mesopotamian concern with hierarchy and administration. One interpretation is that divine punishment stories could naturally settle into this realm because it already possessed the necessary tools, gates, officials, judgment, confinement, and durable authority. And durable authority may be the most important phrase of all, because the prison theory is strongest, not when it chases dramatic lines, but when it notices how relentlessly durable the underworld is. Things sent there stay sent. Rules there stay rules. The land of no return is not improvised. It is stable. Ancient institutions dream of that kind of compliance. Even the dead cannot file a successful appeal. There is something almost comically bureaucratic about it, though only almost. Picture an underworld clerk sighing as another divine intruder arrives without the proper humility forms. Scholars continue to debate whether descent myths should be connected directly to prison interpretations of the Anunnaki. There's no full consensus, and that should keep you calm. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is Ereshkigal's realm as a structured land of no return. The interpretation is that its structure can resemble divine lockup. The imagination is the slow closing of a gate in the dust, heavy dark, not with violence, but with the soft finality of a realm that has done this many times before. So now, the idea deepens. A prison for gods, if such a thing existed in Mesopotamian imagination, may not have looked like a separate building at all. It may have looked like Ereshkigal's kingdom. A place already waiting below the earth, already governed, already equipped to hold those who cross the line, whether mortal, divine, or somewhere uncomfortably between. And once Ereshkigal's realm has settled into place, in your mind, another quiet truth begins to emerge. Mesopotamian stories do not stay still. They travel. They are copied, adapted, translated, reshaped, and occasionally given new clothing by later scribes who inherit old material and make it speak to a slightly different world. Most historians agree that Babylonian and other later Near Eastern traditions often preserve older Sumerian themes while also altering them. What's broadly accepted is that divine figures, underworld concepts, and mythic structures continue across centuries in forms that are familiar but not identical. One interpretation is that prison-like punishment for divine beings may have grown sharper in retelling, and what if each new scribe working by lamplight over damaged clay added just enough shadow to turn an old dissent into a sentence? That is how myths survive, by changing just enough to remain alive. You begin with the obvious point. Sumerian religion does not exist in a neat glass case untouched by time. Akkadian-speaking peoples inherit, reinterpret, and combine older traditions. Babylonian scholars preserve texts while also reworking them. Names shift, roles expand or narrow. Story structures echo forward with new emphases. Most historians agree that this process is normal in the ancient Near East. The evidence we do have points to continuity, yes, but also to transformation. So when later texts present a more elaborate underworld, a more formal divine hierarchy, or a sharper sense of judgment, one interpretation is that older Sumerian ideas are being reframed rather than replaced. And reframing is where a lot of mystery enters. A careful reading might suggest that stories of beings sent below become more resonant over time because later cultures are reading older myths through their own political and theological concerns. A more cautious explanation could be that what sounds prison-like to us is simply the byproduct of literary elaboration. As myths become richer, they naturally acquire more gates, more speeches, more officials, more stern architecture. That does not automatically mean the idea of divine incarceration is becoming more central. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, later retellings may still matter because they preserve the emotional logic more clearly than the earliest fragments do. That is one of the strange gifts of tradition. Sometimes the later version tells you what earlier listeners may already have felt. Most historians agree that the underworld becomes especially vivid in Akkadian literature. Gatekeepers become more memorable. Judges become more defined. The journey below becomes more formalized. What's broadly accepted is that texts such as the Akkadian version of Ishtar's Descent present the underworld with a procedural sharpness that makes it feel highly administered. One interpretation is that these later retellings intensify a prison-like atmosphere already latent in older Sumerian material. The descent is not only symbolic, it is supervised. The realm below is not merely dark, it is regulated. Historians still argue whether these developments reflect genuine theological change or simply literary style. That is an important debate because the ancient world often becomes more detailed on the page without becoming more literal in belief. A scribe may elaborate a scene because it is compelling, not because the community suddenly thinks the cosmos added a new department. Still, the elaboration matters. If later texts keep making the below feel more bureaucratic, more gated, more sentence-like, then the prison interpretation becomes easier for later audiences to imagine, even if it remains debated. You can see this process in how divine assemblies and ranks become easier to picture over time. The gods are not only named, they are situated. They have clearer jurisdictions. The Anunnaki in later contexts are often more distinctly associated with underworld judgment. Most historians agree that this association is one of the reasons they feel so ominous in modern retellings. What's broadly accepted is that they are not simply the prison gods, but they do inhabit a world of verdicts and cosmic boundaries. One interpretation is that as later traditions place them more firmly in judgment, Scene's old rumours of sentenced gods and buried powers become easier to attach to them. A fringe idea proposes that the very phrase Anunnaki had prisons is really a late modern condensation of many older motifs that were never originally stated so bluntly. This theory isn't widely accepted as a formal academic category, but it captures something useful. Ancient traditions often preserve atmosphere better than explicit doctrine. You may not find a clean declaration, but you do find descent gates, no return, judges sealed, spaces, rebellious divine beings, and sacred architecture that teaches secrecy. Later imagination then stitches those together into a more dramatic headline. Not always responsibly, admittedly. The ancient world has suffered many things, and modern clickbait is among them. But even clickbait sometimes leans on real textures. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if later Babylonian and Near Eastern retellings do not invent the prison tone from scratch, but amplify what was already present in the older Sumerian world? That would explain why the theme feels persistent even when the evidence never becomes cleanly explicit. Each retelling adds a little more structure, a little more atmosphere, a little more emphasis on the mechanics of divine order. Over centuries, the old puzzle does not disappear. It grows edges. Archaeology suggests that scribal culture itself encouraged this kind of layering. Texts were copied in schools, adapted in scholarly settings, and preserved in libraries with overlapping traditions. Most historians agree that ancient scribes were not merely passive copyists. They were interpreters, organisers, and sometimes quiet editors of cultural memory. One interpretation is that prison-like readings of divine punishment may owe as much to scribal framing as to original myth. A more cautious explanation could be that the surviving tablets simply happen to preserve the darker, more formal strands of tradition, better than the softer ones. That too is possible. Surviving evidence is never the same thing as total reality. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that later Mesopotamian traditions reshape earlier Sumerian material. The interpretation is that this reshaping may sharpen the sense of divine punishment and confinement. The imagination is the figure of a late scribe smoothing fresh clay, copying an old descent myth, and perhaps leaning into the gravity of the gates just a little more than his teacher did. You can almost picture the scene. Night outside, oil lamp burning low, the stylus presses wedge after wedge into the tablet. Old names pass into new centuries. A damaged line is restored from memory. A phrase is adjusted. A pause becomes a judgment. A descent becomes more formal. A realm becomes more closed. No conspiracy required. Just tradition doing what tradition does, carrying forward the old bones of a story and dressing them in the concerns of the present. Scholars continue to debate how far this process should be pushed. There's no full consensus, and that is exactly right. You should not treat every later detail as proof of some lost original prison myth, but neither should you ignore how stories deepen through repetition. The evidence we do have points to continuity in the themes of hierarchy, descent, judgment, and restricted realms. One interpretation is that later myths sharpen the image of a cosmos, where even divine beings can be subject to sentence. So as you move onward, the old Sumerian world no longer feels isolated. It is speaking through later hands, now its shadows lengthened by Babylonian retelling, its gates more clearly outlined, its lower world more formal. And in that long chain of copied memory, the idea of buried gods and divine confinement does not suddenly appear from nowhere. It gathers layer by layer until the old silence below begins to sound less like simple absence and more like an ancient verdict still echoing in translation. By this point, after walking through temple substructures, divine labour, unrest, underworld gates, foundation rituals, and the long shadow cast by later retellings, you arrive at the place where every responsible guide to ancient mystery eventually has to stop and lower the lantern. This is the point where caution becomes part of the story itself. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian tablets are fragmentary, damaged, context-dependent, and often difficult to translate with perfect confidence. What's broadly accepted is that the evidence survives in pieces, not in the neat, gleaming completeness your inner documentary narrator may desperately want. One interpretation is that prison readings of divine punishment may sometimes be modern projections onto older symbolic language. And what if the real mystery is not that the ancients hid a secret from us, but that time broke the labels and left us guessing in the dark? That may sound less thrilling than a buried divine cell block, but in a way it is more interesting. Because broken evidence forces you to think like an archaeologist rather than a treasure hunter. Archaeology suggests that much of what survives from Mesopotamia reaches us through fragments recovered from ruins, archival dumps, palace libraries, temple precincts, and the accidental mercy of fired clay. Most historians agree that cuneiform texts are both miraculous and maddening. A tablet can survive for thousands of years and still decide to snap right through the line you most wanted to read. The evidence we do have points to a culture of astonishing textual richness, but also to a record full of gaps, damaged signs, uncertain restorations, and words whose exact nuance still sparks scholarly argument. In other words, the clay speaks, but not always clearly. That matters enormously for a topic like this. If you're asking whether Sumerian or later Mesopotamian texts describe gods sentenced and buried alive in something like prisons, you're asking a question that sits right at the edge of literal and symbolic language. A careful reading might suggest that certain terms, images and scenes cluster around confinement. A more cautious explanation could be that the same scenes are better read as underworld geography, ritual descent, humiliation, or mythic subordination, and sometimes the difference comes down to a damaged sign, a lost parallel text, or the uncomfortable fact that ancient scribes did not know they were writing for future people who enjoy overconfident thumbnails. Historians still argue whether some passages that sound carceral to modern ears were ever intended to evoke imprisonment specifically. That debate is not a weakness, it is the honest centre of the subject. Most historians agree that translation is not simply a matter of swapping one word for another. Words carry worlds with them. A term that suggests binding or enclosing in one context may signal ritual control in another. A phrase about being cast down may imply death in one tablet and cosmic demotion in another. What's broadly accepted is that context does much of the heavy lifting, and Mesopotamian context is often annoyingly incomplete. Still incomplete does not mean meaningless. The evidence we do have points to consistent themes: hierarchy, descent, judgment, gates, no returned, restriction, and layered sacred spaces. One interpretation is that these patterns make prison-like readings plausible, especially when combined with divine conflict traditions. Another interpretation is that modern readers raised in a world obsessed with institutions of confinement may be over-detecting prison language, where ancient audiences heard something broader and more mythic. That's a possibility, not a certainty. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground here is actually pretty rich. Mesopotamian people really did imagine the cosmos in structured layers. They really did depict divine assemblies and judgments. They really did describe the underworld as a regulated realm. They really did build sacred spaces full of controlled access and buried significance. Those are not speculative claims. What's broadly accepted is that all of those elements belong to the mainstream historical and archaeological picture. The interpretation comes when you combine them and ask whether they amount to a concept of divine imprisonment. That is where caution earns its pay. A fringe idea proposes that scholars have overlooked explicit evidence of Anunnaki prisons because academic tradition is too reluctant to follow uncomfortable implications. This theory isn't widely accepted, and to be fair, conspiracy is often what people reach for when reality turns out to be complicated and dusty. A more cautious explanation could be that the evidence simply does not say as much as enthusiasts wish it said. Ancient ambiguity is not always suppression. Sometimes it is just damaged genre, and the old human habit of telling stories in ways that resist tidy categorization, which frankly was very inconsiderate of them from the perspective of modern internet certainty. But ambiguity does not kill the mystery, it refines it. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the deepest lesson of this whole subject is that Mesopotamian myth does not divide cleanly into fact on one side and fantasy on the other? Instead, it operates across layers. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part gives you courts gods, underworld judges, temple basements, buried foundations, and cosmic hierarchy. The interpretation asks whether those things together suggest a framework for divine confinement. The imagination is the cool silence between damaged lines, where you can almost hear a verdict, but not quite enough to quote it. That middle ground is where good history and good bedtime storytelling meet. Most historians agree that responsible reading means resisting two opposite temptations. One is to flatten everything into ordinary explanations so thoroughly that the old texts lose their emotional strangeness. The other is to inflate every strange image into hidden proof of a dramatic secret. What's broadly accepted is that both mistakes distort the past. One interpretation is that the safest path is also the richest one. Follow the patterns, acknowledge the debates, let the ancient world remain partly unfamiliar. You do not need certainty to feel how eerie it is that so many of these stories imagine power being sent downward, judged below, fixed under order. Scholars continue to debate the exact force of key terms, the relationship between Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, and the degree to which later prison-like readings are warranted. There's no full consensus, and that should make you breathe easier rather than harder. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That line matters especially here because uncertainty is not an obstacle to wonder. It is the shape wonder takes when it has read enough tablets to know better than to shout. Imagine a tablet in your hands, cool and faintly rough, its edges, chipped one corner, lost to some ancient collapse. The signs remain clear for a while, then fade into damage. You can read enough to know that the passage matters. A god is named, a lower place is mentioned, a decree is implied. Then the break arrives, and the sentence vanishes into absence. That, in a way, is the whole subject. Not a lack of evidence, but evidence cut short. Not silence, but interrupted speech. An interrupted speech can be more haunting than a complete answer. So this is why scholars stay careful. Not because the question is silly, not because the prison idea is impossible, but because the evidence lives in fragments, and fragments deserve patience. Most historians agree that the ancient Mesopotamian world is strange enough without being forced into modern categories too quickly. One interpretation is that stories of sentenced gods and buried powers may preserve genuine ancient intuitions about divine confinement. Another is that we are seeing overlapping symbols and giving them a sharper outline than the texts themselves require. Both possibilities remain alive, which means that as you stand at the edge of the broken tablets, looking down into the old dust, the best thing you can carry forward is not certainty, but care. Care with words, care with silence, care with the temptation to mistake a vivid possibility for a settled fact. The clay has already survived millennia. It can survive a little more patience from us. And with that patience in mind, you can finally step into the moonlit part of the story without losing your footing. This is the stretch where rumour, fringe theory, and modern fascination all gather around the old clay like moths around a lamp. Most historians agree that there is no full scholarly consensus supporting dramatic claims about literal Anunnaki prisons in the way modern retellings often present them. What's broadly accepted is that the evidence remains indirect, fragmentary, and open to several readings. One interpretation is that later storytellers have woven together real Mesopotamian themes of descent, judgment gates, and buried space into a more dramatic prison narrative. And what if that is exactly why the idea has such staying power? Because it rests not on one decisive tablet, but on 100 shadows that seem to lean the same direction. This is where you hear the louder voices. A popular rumour claims that ancient Mesopotamian temples were built directly over sealed chambers, containing rebellious divine beings, specifically the Anunnaki punished and buried alive beneath sacred foundations. It is a gripping image. You can see why it travels so well. It has architecture, punishment secrecy, and just enough ancient dust to feel untouchably old. But a more cautious explanation could be that modern retellings are compressing multiple separate motifs into one convenient legend. Temples did have buried foundations and restricted spaces. Myths did describe descent judgment and divine hierarchy. The underworld did function as a realm of no return. Yet stitching all of that into a literal prison system for gods is a much stronger claim than the evidence comfortably supports. That does not kill the fascination, it refines it. Most historians agree that fringe theories often grow where real gaps in the record already exist. The evidence we do have points to an ancient world full of layered ruins, damaged texts, evolving traditions, and suggestive imagery. One interpretation is that modern readers, especially those drawn to hidden history narratives, are responding to something genuine in the atmosphere of Mesopotamian culture. The world of the tablets really is full of sealed thresholds, subterranean meaning, and divine beings subjected to order. A fringe idea proposes that scholars are too conservative in dismissing the prison interpretation, and that certain old myths only make complete sense if literal underground confinement once stood behind them. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because the symbolism is already halfway there. And symbolism, once it gets a flashlight and a dramatic narrator, rarely settles down again. You can trace how the rumour grows. First comes the underworld, already structured and closed. Then come the Anunnaki, linked in some traditions to underworld judgment. Then come rebel gods, labour unrest, and being sent below. Then come temple substructures and foundation deposits, which teach the imagination to associate buried space with sacred power. Then later retellings sharpen the mood with more gates, more hierarchy, more finality. At that point, it becomes very easy for a modern mind to say, all right then, perhaps the gods had prisons. Not because a single ancient text states it so cleanly, but because the pieces seem to want to fit. Historians still argue whether that fit is revealing or misleading. That exact phrase matters here because section 14 is where you have to let the debate speak loudly. Some scholars continue to treat the prison reading as an overreach, a product of modern language applied too firmly to older concepts of underworld, exile, and cosmic restriction. Others are more open to the idea that certain scenes really do carry a punitive force stronger than ordinary afterlife symbolism. There's no full consensus, and that is not a flaw in the subject. It is the subject. Mesopotamian religion is full of images that resist a single tidy label. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. If the mood is strong, we can say that too. And the mood is undeniably strong. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the attraction of the Anunnaki prison theory is not really about proving that ancient gods sat in literal underground cells? What if it is about sensing correctly that Mesopotamian myth imagines divine power as accountable to order? That is the real shock inside the rumour. Not aliens, not secret tunnels, not some forgotten supernatural jail blueprint folded behind a broken tablet. The shock is that the cosmos in these stories is not lawless even for the gods. Rank exists, judgment exists, consequences exist. The very beings who help define order may themselves be trapped by it. That is a much older and more durable mystery than the headline version. A careful reading might suggest that modern fringe theories are useful not because they are right in every detail, but because they exaggerate patterns that really are present. They take descent and make it imprisonment. They take hidden chambers and make them cells. They take divine judges and turn them into wardens. A more cautious explanation could be that this is exactly how myths get distorted in the modern age. True enough. But distortions often reveal what people find emotionally persuasive. And what people find persuasive here is telling. They look at Mesopotamia and instinctively feel that this is a civilization where dangerous things are not always destroyed. They are buried, bound, sealed, and ruled over. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia valued order with unusual intensity because daily life required it. Water, labour, ritual, kingship, storage, property and offerings all depended on the systems holding together. What's broadly accepted is that its myths reflect that same seriousness. One interpretation is that the prison motif, even when overstated, resonates because it dramatises the oldest Mesopotamian instinct of all. When a force threatens the structure, you do not simply wish it away. You put it where it can no longer shake the centre. That instinct can look frightening in modern retellings, but it also makes myth feel real. A popular rumour claims that every major tell in southern Mesopotamia hides some remnant of divine incarceration stories that archaeology has failed to identify. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it is far too sweeping to trust. Archaeology suggests instead that tales are complicated accumulations of ordinary urban rebuilding, sacred change, destruction, repair, and the long patience of mudbrick. Still, when you stand on one of those mounds in imagination, knowing that whole older worlds lie below it, becomes easy to understand why the rumour keeps breathing. Buried cities already feel like secrets. Add broken myths and the ground itself begins to seem like a witness refusing to talk. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. That line matters most here, where the clues are most seductive. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the Mesopotamian world of divine hierarchy, underworld judgment, temple secrecy, and buried ritual significance. The interpretation is that later readers may reasonably sense prison-like themes in the old stories. The imagination is the moonlit idea that under some ancient stair, under some forgotten shrine, beneath the formal order of hymns and offerings, the memory of a sentence still sleeps in the dust. Scholars continue to debate whether fringe theories deserve engagement at all, or whether doing so only feeds modern confusion. But one interpretation is that careful engagement actually helps. It lets you separate the useful question from the sensational packaging. The useful question is not, did archaeologists miss a literal dungeon of the Anunnaki? The useful question is, why do so many real Mesopotamian motifs make that image feel almost plausible? And the answer quietly is because Mesopotamia already imagined a world of powerful beings subject to Gates' decrees, descent, and no return. So you can let the moonlight stay on the rumour for a moment without surrendering your judgment to it. You can admit that the theory is not widely accepted. You can admit that modern retellings often push too far. And you can still feel the shiver of the deeper possibility beneath it that the oldest cities on Earth told stories in which even the gods might be sentenced fixed below and kept under the architecture of order. Not certainly, not cleanly, but hauntingly enough that the rumour still walks the old temple mounds long after the scribes are gone. And after all that dust, all those gates, all those broken lines in clay, you arrive at the quietest question of the night. Not whether we can force the evidence into one final answer, because we cannot. Not whether some hidden tablet will suddenly appear and solve every old argument, because history is rarely that polite. The question waiting for you now is softer and deeper than that. What does the silence mean? Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion joined law, ritual, kingship, burial, and cosmic order into one deeply structured vision of reality. What's broadly accepted is that this world imagined powerful beings moving through layers of rank judgment and sacred boundary. One interpretation is that tales of sentenced gods reflect ancient fears about rebellion and order. And what if the deepest prison in the whole story is not a chamber under a temple at all, but the silence left behind when the tablets stop speaking? That is where the whole journey folds inward. You have walked through the mainstream ground first. Ancient Mesopotamia truly was a civilization of cities, temples writing law labour, and elaborate sacred imagination. The underworld was real to them as a meaningful realm, not just poetic wallpaper. The Anunnaki were real figures in their mythic whippets and religious vocabulary, though not in the simple sensational form modern rumour often prefers. Gates mattered, decrees mattered, buried foundations mattered. What's broadly accepted is that below the surface in both architecture and myth, Mesopotamian culture placed enormous symbolic weight on depth, hiddenness, and controlled access. That much is solid enough to sleep on. Then comes the interpretive middle, the place where careful readers keep their lantern low. A careful reading might suggest that these old stories preserve more than an ordinary afterlife. They may preserve the language of removal, restriction, judgment, and containment. A more cautious explanation could be that the prison tone modern listeners hear is often the result of overlapping symbols rather than a literal doctrine of divine incarceration. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether particular scenes of descent and confinement should be treated as punishment narratives or as broader expressions of cosmic order. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And then there is the part that belongs to the imagination, but only the gentle kind. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the reason this subject clings to you is not because the ancients left behind a secret dungeon map, but because they understood something about power that still feels true? Order does not simply shine. Order confines. Every system, sacred or earthly, must decide what to do with whatever threatens its shape. In Mesopotamia, that answer often seems to be downward. Below the city, below the temple, below the human world, below return. Whether that is prison in the modern sense matters less suddenly than the emotional pattern it leaves behind. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that solved fear spatially. It built walls, gates, channels, platforms, and layered sacred spaces. It imagined judges in the underworld and rulers in heaven. It placed meaning under thresholds and under floors. One interpretation is that tales of gods sentenced and buried alive, however debated, are really stories about the need to locate danger somewhere, not destroy it completely, not always erase it. Simply place it where it can no longer disturb the centre. That is both practical and eerie, which is a very Mesopotamian combination. A fringe idea proposes that the ancient world knew far more explicit traditions of divine imprisonment than the surviving tablets now reveal. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has survived because ancient silence can feel almost intentional when enough pieces seem to point the same way. Still, the safer truth is more delicate. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And perhaps that is exactly why the question stays alive. A full answer would close the gate. A partial answer leaves it slightly open, and the human mind, being what it is, always leans toward the crack. Scholars continue to debate how far those clues should be taken. There's no full consensus, and that is not failure. It is honesty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part tells you about cities, gods, underworlds, judgment, sacred architecture, and buried ritual meaning. The interpretation suggests that certain divine beings may have been imagined as subject to punishment through confinement or descent. The imagination asks one last question in the dark. If a god could be sentenced in story, what did that teach the people listening above ground about law, fear, and the cost of crossing the line? Maybe that is the deepest answer you get tonight, because the tablets do stop, the lines do break, the voices do thin out, the old cities collapse into mounds, and the chambers below fill with dust and silence and the patient pressure of earth. What remains is not a solved case, but a pattern. A world where nothing important is ever merely on the surface. A world where the lower spaces hold memory, warning, and judgment. A world where even the divine can be imagined inside order rather than beyond it. And now the pace can soften. So let the old gates grow dim in your mind now. Let the temple walls cool under the night air. Let the dust settle back over the brick steps, over the buried thresholds, over the tablets stacked long ago in rooms no one enters anymore. Picture the last lamp in a scribe's hand fading low. The stylus set aside the clay, still damp enough to remember the pressure of words. Somewhere beyond the city, reeds move quietly by dark water. Somewhere within the city, a gate closes for the evening, with no drama at all, just habit, just order, just the small comfort of knowing where everything belongs. Let the underworld drift farther away now too, not as a place of fear, but as a distant old idea, a deep chamber in the imagination of a people who lived close to earth and close to consequence. Let Ereshkigal's halls fall silent. Let the Anunnaki become only names again, old names carried on clay, softened by time. Let the rumours loosen their grip. They do not need to be solved tonight. They only need to be set down gently like a sealed tablet returned to its shelf. And if one question still lingers, that is all right. Bedtime history is kinder when it leaves one door slightly open. You do not have to walk through it. You can simply rest near it, listening to the old wind move through broken walls, knowing that some mysteries remain, not because they are hiding from you, but because they were never meant to become perfectly flat and easy. So breathe a little slower now. Let the oldest cities in the world sink softly into darkness. Let the buried chambers become only cool earth again. Let the judgments fade into distance, and the gates into shadow, and the stories into that pleasant space between memory and dream. You have followed the clues far enough for one night. The clay can wait. The silence can wait. The unanswered things can wait too. Rest now while the ancient world settles back under the sand, and the last whisper of its old order drifts away into sleep.